The afternoon sun was so scorching that Sergeant T, a U.S. Army Ranger, peered through binoculars at the village in the distance. There were Syrian tanks and infantry hiding there. Sergeant T was a member of a U.S. Joint Special Operations Command contingent of about 30 men from the Delta Force and Ranger Regiment. Along with the Americans are about 100 Kurdish and Arab soldiers belonging to the SDF. Together they are stationed at this outpost, located inside the Conoco plant. The site of the plant is a huge oil and gas field that was once controlled by ISIS. The once thriving ISIS rapidly collapsed under the weight of the US and SDF coalition forces and the Russian-Syrian alliance. The US and SDF seized the field with great economic and political value. On the opposite bank of this oil field, across the Euphrates River, is the city of Deir Ezzor, controlled by the Syrian army and Russian mercenaries. A few days ago, U.S. forces reconnoitered that the Syrians had begun to build up their forces in the area, near the Conoco outpost. And now the small army numbered 500 men, with 27 tanks and APCs, and the Syrians had hidden their tanks inside nearby villages. Not only that, but the Syrians built 122 mm howitzer positions and 81 mm mortar positions a few kilometers away. It seems that they were preparing for a large-scale offensive. The US and SDF were not only at an absolute numerical disadvantage, but were also equipped with only light weapons and a small number of Javelin anti-tank missiles. With their current forces alone, the US and SDF were absolutely unable to confront the Syrian army. The US forces also found from radio listening that much military personnel on the other side spoke Russian. The US forces had been avoiding direct conflict with the Russian forces in Syria, and if there were Russian forces on the other side, it would be a big problem for the US forces to deal with. So the US forces contacted the Russian military, and the Russians said that there was not a single Russian soldier in the area, and they had no knowledge of this small army near the Conoco outpost, nor did they have any control over the Syrians. That being the case, the US military could only be prepared and wait for things to move forward. 30 kilometers behind the Conoco outpost, the US forces also set up a support base, operated jointly by the US Army Green Berets and the US Marines. As a precaution, they have formed a 10-strong squad, ready to reinforce US forces at the Conoco outpost. But even with the addition of this support force, the US troops could not stand up to the powerful enemy. Time was passing by seconds. The sun was gradually going down in the west. The sky appeared brilliant evening sun. Under this beautiful sky, a tense atmosphere was building up, tranquility that could be broken at any moment by the sound of artillery. At 20:30, the Syrians and the Russians began to move, splitting into two lines and advancing slowly toward the outpost, from the left and right, as they tried to move stealthily under the cover of night. By 2300 hours, the Syrians and Russians had come within 1.5 miles of the outpost, and the tension was at its peak, as the 125 mm cannon of the T-72 tank pointed at the outpost. The shells swept across the night sky with a piercing sound, as the Syrians finally opened fire. Their shells landed 500 meters from the outpost, and it appeared that the Syrians and Russians were hoping that the US forces would know what to do in the face of a formidable opponent. The US troops aimed heavy machine gun tracer fire at the front of the Syrians and Russians, a warning shot to show the defenders' determination. And at the American headquarters, Officers received reports and contacted the Russian force again, hoping that the Russians would end the attack. But the Russian answer remained the same. There is not a single Russian soldier there. And if the army there starts attacking, there is nothing the Russian force can do to stop them. Now, the Americans and the Kurds had only two choices: either retreat or fight. The Americans and the SDF choose to fight. They began firing at the Syrian army and the Russian mercenaries, and the Syrian artillery began directly bombarding the outposts. Tracer rounds fired by both sides lit up the night sky. At this time, that small reinforcements of the American troops also set out on the road. But could they help Conoco's garrison repel a much stronger enemy force? The US forces weren't crazy, and they weren't fighting another battle of the Alamo. The real reinforcements for the defenders came from the air. The first air power to attack was the two MQ-1 Predator drones that had been hovering over the Conoco factory for many hours. They had been taking images of the battlefield and sending them back to US command. In addition to conducting reconnaissance missions, each Predator carries two Hellfire missiles that can attack ground targets. The two Predators locked onto the T-72 tanks rushing ahead. And soon, 3 Syrian T-72 tanks were hit and set on fire. Immediately after, 2 F-15E Strike Eagles appeared in the sky, and they flew directly at the Syrian artillery positions, those long-range firepowers that were now the greatest threat to the outpost's defenders. With the JDAMs they carried, the Strike Eagles leveled these artillery positions. The Syrian army and Russian PMCs, hit by the surprise airstrike, began to spread out in loose formation, bypassing the destroyed tanks and launching attacks on the outposts on foot. But they did not anticipate that an even more horrific strike was about to come. An AC-130 gunship flew overhead, guided by a forward air controller, and struck ground targets with the 3 guns it carried. One armored vehicle after another was destroyed by the 105mm cannon, while the 40mm Bofors cannon and 25mm autocannon fired a dense barrage of shells to attack the soldiers on foot. 25mm autocannon fired tracer rounds that looked like a shining scythe of death in the night sky, reaping lives. The Syrian and Russian coalition forces had only 12.7mm heavy machine guns and truck-mounted 23mm autocannon for anti-aircraft fire, but such anti-aircraft fire was negligible against US air power. Just as the Syrians and Russians struggled with gunship strikes, new killers emerged as 4 US Army Apache helicopters approached the battlefield from 2 directions, hovering a few kilometers from enemies, at ultra-low altitude, striking the remaining Syrian vehicles and tanks with Hellfire missiles, that neither the Syrians nor the Russians could even see them. At high altitude, the US Air Force's F-22 stealth fighters also entered the fray, as they dropped JDAMs to bomb enemy forces. This is said to be the first time that F-22s have conducted ground attacks in real combat. And dozens of kilometers away, the Marines' HIMARS also pounded the enemy. At 23:30, that small reinforcement force of Green Berets and Marines, in 4 MRAPs, came right to the edge of the battlefield. But they didn't dare to advance, because the artillery shells and missiles, flying in front of them, were a very big threat to the fragile MRAPs, and even in the chaos of the battlefield, they might be mistakenly hit by the US aircraft. So they stopped quietly in place and watched the fierce battle. It was until 1 a.m. the next morning, in between airstrikes, that they went inside the outpost. Whether they arrived or not was no longer relevant. The Syrians and Russians had been rooted under a heavy air attack. That might no longer be called a battle, but a massacre. Wave after wave of American warplanes arrived, dropped munitions, left. And finally, the US forces even took off B-52 bombers from distant bases and flew overhead, sweeping the entire battlefield with high explosive bombs. By this time, the US military had won big, and the B-52 bombing was no longer even just for military purposes, but was a demonstration of power and determination. At 2:30 on February 8th, as the Syrian army and Russian mercenaries began to retreat, and US forces ceased strikes, the battlefield fell silent, with the night sky dotted with stars. Only the burning wreckage of vehicles on the ground, and the bodies scattered in the darkness, indicated that a fierce battle had just taken place here. As a result of the battle, some 200 to 300 soldiers from the Syrian army and Russian mercenaries were killed, including about 100 Russian PMCs, while the Conoco outpost garrison, with only one Kurdish soldier, was slightly wounded. Although other sources indicate that the Syrians had just over 100 killed in action, while the Russian mercenaries lost just over 20, the Americans won the battle anyway. The battle is like a starting game, where whoever blinks first loses. It is no surprise that the United States, the world's #1 military power, won this battle. The Syrian war is a complex, bloody, dark war, and the Battle of Khasham, a Hollywood-style battle, adds an ironic note to this war.